This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The three big questions that confront every one of us humans on this earth. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And of course, the big one, what happens to us when we die? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me is the co-author of a new book, actually the third in a series that address this issue by talking to people who've had a glimpse on the other side of the veil. The previous books, Stories of Heaven and the Afterlife, real near-death experience stories. The newest book out, Near-Death Experiences, featuring 101 short stories from people who have been to the other side and returned. He's the co-author with Randy Kay of these books. We welcome Shaun Tabatt to the program for the first time. Shaun, welcome.
Derek, it is a joy and a pleasure to see you, my friend. Truly my honor to be on the show. I've been a fan of yours and Sharon's work for so many years, and just looking forward to chatting with you today.
You're very gracious. Shaun, you and Randy Kay have co-authored three of these books now, dealing with this. I guess two questions. Number one, what brought you two together? And then number two, why choose this particular genre, if you will, what some refer to as heavenly tourism, maybe rather dismissively, but why pick this as a topic?
Well, as some of your viewers are going to know, who probably know me already, I've worked in the Christian publishing space for 10 plus years, and I met Randy about 6 years ago. We were working on his first book that told a part of his heaven experience called "Dying to Meet Jesus." And honestly, at that time, I've worked for a charismatic publishing imprint, and that was still fairly new. Afterlife stories, I was certainly interested, but largely skeptical. And so Randy's book and John Burke's book, Imagine Heaven, who was also published by one of our sister imprints, those were my first two kind of near-death experience books. And then ironically, I left Chosen Books before Randy's book even went to market. Like, I had gotten it all ready, and then I switched to another publisher. And really all the crazy we've had for the last 5 years started from Randy being a guest on my podcast. We did a podcast interview. Even there were some technical glitches. The audio quality wasn't great in some parts. And I was like, man, do I even release this? Because I'm such a perfectionist with podcasts. And my wife was like, the content is so good. You got to put it out. And so we released the interview, and it just went viral. Millions of views, and listens. And it just took on a life of its own. And that spawned Randy and me starting another podcast called Two Christian Dudes. And we wanted to do other things, not just talk about NDEs, but we started interviewing other people who'd had NDEs, and those went viral. And we started getting messages saying, God healed me during this. I watched your interview, or, I don't even know the Lord, but I've decided to dedicate my life to following Jesus. And so we just started seeing this, I don't know if I want to call it strange fruit, but like you, I've been in podcasting and broadcasting for a long time. I've done 1,000 plus interviews, and while I've certainly got responses, I'd never seen something like that. I think some of it was just timing with what the world was going through in 2020, people losing so many friends and family members. I mean, that brought people to having an interest in what's going on the other side. So some of it was just, it was a viral moment. I think we're also entering into another stage of that with what we see happening on the world stage. You'd also mentioned heavenly tourism. We did definitely see a whole glut of fairly called heavenly tourism books, in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And then those books, to some degree, not that the category was completely stale, but they kind of fell out of favor just with some of the controversy and fallout. And I feel like now we've entered into a new cycle. I'll say there's at least a 5 to 10 year run on this where just there's a popularity and a cultural interest in this that is still on the rise. We met Randy and I 5 years ago, and we're just kind of not quite hockey stick up, but the momentum is continuing. It hasn't slowed down. So happenstance, I worked on a book. We did a podcast episode. This birthed Randy Kay Ministries. He had no official ministry, and just the podcast stuff, all of a sudden, his whole life is full time to running that ministry now. So God had a lot of intention with it, but it wasn't anything we planned because Randy and I are brilliant. We just kind of fell into it. We're like, hey, people's lives are being changed. Let's keep doing this.
Yeah, I can speak to the odd thing of having. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pause this for just a moment. I'm going to edit this out, and we'll come back to it. We've got a contractor coming here.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Brittany. All right, very good. We will be here. You bet. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Now just texting Sharon to let her know Clever Stone just called, which is odd because I had my phone on Do Not Disturb and it rang through anyway.
It's okay. Half the time I have dogs barking, occasionally a naked toddler, something happening in the background during the interview.
Okay, I will pick back up. At least it came at the end of an answer to a question.
It was a good time.
So
Yes.
So I can just edit. We'll cut into the next question here. And that's the beauty of having the separate streams, just cut to the other. So for people not familiar with the term NDE or near-death experience, how do you distinguish that from, say, a vision or a waking dream?
Right. Well, the actual term near-death experiences or near-death experience, and I get into this briefly in the book, that was first coined back in 1975. Raymond Moody, he's a doctor. He wrote a book called Life After Life, which was really the first major release. You had George Ritchie and a few others had shared their stories, but that book brought NDEs into the popular conversation. And, essentially a near-death experience is somebody who is near death or close to death. In some of these stories or situations, people do clinically die, no heartbeat, no brain activity. But there are some interesting distinctions to be made. And this is one of the things I do get into in the book is, there's a near-death experience, and there's also what we would refer to as a spiritually transformative experience. And Randy and I started encountering these people where they weren't sick, they didn't die, they weren't near death, and some of them have described it as almost being at such a place, almost like a soul death or just a personal crisis moment, like life was just really terrible. Maybe they were depressed, but they entered into what basically had all the hallmarks of an NDE experience, but again, they weren't dying and they weren't sick. And so so we do talk about that in the book as well, where, there is this other classification of experience where what they encounter in heaven or hell in those visions or experiences, very similar to what the person who has died and crossed the veil has experienced. The results in terms of the life impact and how it changes them, also very similar. And we don't address this in this book specifically. I think we'll touch on this in a future book. We would kind of bucket all of those together. And then in the kind of on the charismatic ministry side, kind of that space, you do have people who talk about having these seer, prophetic visions of heaven, visions of all kinds of things. And I think a lot of people tend to conflate those with these afterlife encounters. And they're not, it's not an apples to apples thing. I think, yes, there is legitimacy to some of those experiences. But in terms of weightiness, the impact it has on people, I don't think we can say those are exactly the same thing. I always like to try to put a little bit more weight on somebody who's actually clinically died and crossed the veil. I feel like that is how God designed the world, and that's how things kind of function. So, I would probably weight those experiences a little more ahead of the spiritually transformative experience or kind of the seer prophetic vision. But I mean, those are some of the different classifications. That's one of the things I really am happy that we were able to do in this book, because when you lean into more of the mainstream or mainstream secular, even some of the kind of the new agey side, I mean, there's lots of weird ditches and side trails in the near-death experience space. Right. They tend to focus a lot more on terminology, giving language of how to talk about the different types of experiences, the different stages of the experience. And we structured this new book, Near-Death Experiences, around kind of what I define as 9 stages of the NDE process or timeline. You don't see that as much on the Christian publishing side. You tend to see Johnny had some kind of a catastrophic event. Johnny crossed the veil and went to heaven, went to hell. He came back. His life was transformed. And that's really the typical NDE book. We've not tended as much to put the structure and language around it. So I feel like we can communicate these stories efficiently, share them effectively. And so I'm actually really excited to introduce that to the Christian publishing side of this. And honestly, that was one thing that really surprised me, because I've read tons of books on the more mainstream side, and there's a ton of these kind of structures, frameworks to think through and process. And that was the biggest piece of feedback. We had a lot of endorsers and people who looked at the book before it went to print. And even John Burke, New York Times bestselling author of Imagine Heaven, probably the biggest author in the Christian NDE publishing space, even he said, the framework is going to be revolutionary and revelatory for our side of this conversation. And it kind of blew me away in the sense that I was like, yeah, but there's like 30 of these frameworks and all these other books from much more well-known authors than me and Randy. And yet for some reason we've failed to put that into the Christian side of this conversation. So I just hope it'll give people structure for thinking through and telling these stories. And so honestly, I was surprised that that was the one thing everybody pointed out to me.
How much of this reluctance to give it a sort of a framework comes from uh, the caution that a lot of Christians will have when you're talking about this? Like, look, the Bible doesn't speak to this specifically, so we really need to be careful here about these kind of stories and trying to take a personal experience that may not be grounded in biblical theology as actual evidence of what's going to happen after our last breath.
Well, I think there is definitely a hesitancy in that we don't want people to put one man's or one woman's experience above what we read in Scripture or what falls within Orthodox Christian theology. So that is certainly a valid concern. You know, if you're a Calvinist hardcore, don't start interviewing people about near-death experiences because it's going to stretch your theology significantly. And I would say that was a real struggle for me early on, in the sense that people are going to tell you parts of their stories that don't fit with our very wooden boxes that we've tended to put things in. For instance, you'll have circumstances where somebody will have died. They will be taken into this hell experience, maybe being put in their eternal place of torment, and an angel will show up or Jesus will show up. And basically the short of it is, well, because his mother, his grandmother has been praying for him for 30 years, I'm basically going to give them a second chance, and they'll get plucked out of this hell experience. And we've had a range of people talk about how the intercession, especially of moms and grandmas, dads, grandpas, we need to really up our prayer and intervention game because it's always the mom or the grandma. But that completely flies in the face of our typical thought where it's like, well, if you want to go to heaven, this is that road. You want to go to hell, this is going to be this other road. And you just get into this real gray area. The more of these stories you get into, God in his kindness seems to try to give people as many chances as they can have to turn to him. And that it doesn't fit within our very wooden theology. And so, you know, there's the deeper you go down this rabbit hole, the amount that you're going to be challenged theologically is kind of never ending. But, you know, Randy's and my sort of framework is, you know, it has to fit within what we read in Scripture, has to fit within the boundaries of typical Orthodox Christian teaching. And, you know, and is, you know, the hallmark we're always looking for is, does this story elevate Jesus and make him bigger and really introduce you to him? Or is this putting the man or woman who's telling the story on a pedestal and they're trying to get attention? And with the people we highlight in the book, with the people we try to bring on for interviews, we're looking for people who clearly they've been transformed. Clearly they're a different person. They want to make sure you know the Lord and that you're going to heaven. And that seems to be a true hallmark of somebody who's had a legitimate experience versus if it's somebody trying to sell a book and get fame and just, you know, Jesus is an afterthought. You know, for the people who are all about, you know, do you know the Lord, brother? Like that's really what we're looking for. Now I'm more than happy to talk to people who've had other kinds of experiences, who maybe they come from a different worldview. And like, I love those kinds of conversations because it challenges me and sharpens me. But by and large, the content that Randy and I do together, the content that Randy and I do for our books, it's going to fall into that first category where, you know, as much as we're able to, we screen these guests and make sure they're legitimate. And, you know, again, Jesus is looming large in their story, not them.
The one interview I've done, I see is one of the on this topic is a gentleman who is featured in your book, and that's Brian Melvin. And that was the thing that really struck me about his story, was that Brian was not telling the story to make it seem like, you know, I'm such a great guy, that's why I got out. It's his life was really changed. But I want to come back to the prayers of mothers and grandmothers. I've always found this to be really powerful. This image of this bent and elderly woman who in the eyes of the world would be of no account. You know, she's a grandmother, she's 80 whatever years old. You know, I think of my mother who's 86, who just are petitioning the Lord on a daily basis for their families, for their children, their grandchildren, in some cases great grandchildren. and how different they must appear in the spirit realm. What? Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring that out as one of the points in this book. What were some of the accounts that you heard? How do people know that it was through the prayers of their mother or grandmother that they were saved?
In some instances, it's actually, whoever comes on the scene during their time in hell, whether it's an angel or Jesus, there's usually some kind of a declaration of, well, because of this, I'm pulling you out of this place of torture, or I'm giving you a second chance. So sometimes it's like that. Ian McCormick is another favorite of mine. He's a gentleman who was stung by 5 box jellyfish. One of those
Oh,
is enough to kill a full grown man, let alone five. There's a whole comedy of errors in him getting to the hospital and he dies. But he has this whole experience in the ambulance where he enters into this kind of sort of in between vision space where he sees his mom interceding and praying for him on the other side of the world. And for whatever reason, she feels led to go into prayer because something's wrong with her son. And as he knows and can kind of see that she's interceding for him, and he's not a believer, he's like, well, I want to go someplace good. God, I don't even know how to follow you. He starts seeing the Lord's Prayer, like he can see it with it. Well, whether, and I don't know at this point, is he still in his physical body? Is he out of his body? He hadn't really died yet, but I think he was kind of going in between. But he sees the Lord's Prayer and is praying through it as he's in the ambulance. And so that's a circumstance where he knew and could see that his mom was praying for him. And they talk about this after the fact. But usually it's a very clear declaration during the experience that it's not because of anything you did, like you deserve hell, but it's because mom, grandma, she's been praying for you for decades, and I made her this promise, or her prayers are not going to return void. And so for me, my faith in the power of prayer and intercession and the eternal difference that makes is just bolstered like never before. Because, yes, does prayer make a difference? Sure. But you encounter enough of these stories where it made an eternal difference, where somebody didn't just end up in hell for all eternity. By gosh, we should probably be praying a lot more than we do. Like I didn't realize that the stakes were that high until I heard so many of these stories.
That really strikes a chord. One of the things that Sharon and I found really edifying about this app that has been developed for us, and it's an app that's used by a lot of ministries, churches, broadcast ministries, media ministries like ours, is a messaging feature where people can communicate one with another. And we found that the prayer request section that we set up in there has become the most active section. I go to my iPhone, you get the little red bubble with how many messages you got there.
Right.
That little app has become the most active app on my phone.
Wow.
With the with the exception of the air raid alert app from Israel over the last couple of days as we're recording this. But many of those prayer requests from people deal with family members who have strayed. And I think this will be a real encouragement to them. I mean, setting aside the near-death aspect of this, just the knowledge that, yes, the unseen realm is listening on both sides, and it does make a difference. It may not happen today or tomorrow, even 10 years from now, but at some point, those prayers will avail much. And so, yes, encouraging us to continue those prayers is, I think, a really good point. I'm glad that's in your book.
Well, let me interrupt you for a moment, Derek. And another comment related to that is, and I totally lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Well, let me throw this out there. Maybe you can get back on track as we continue. Because here's another one I know that is a painful experience for many people, especially if you're coming from, say, Roman Catholicism or one of the Lutheran denominations, where it's believed that you have to be baptized in order to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And there are children who are lost too soon, whether through some illness or because they were terminated in the womb. And then the mother later regrets that. And the question is, what happens to those children? Right. How many, have you encountered any stories there about what happens to those children lost too soon?
Right. Well, and what I find fascinating, one, is we do tend to have a pretty developed theology in the Western church and the Christian church of, well, babies, children who are lost, they automatically kind of go to heaven. Like we talk about that. We often don't talk about our theological reasoning for that. We just say that, and just try to comfort people and make people feel better. But I can think of off the top of my head at least 4 or 5 of these experiences that we've met. Randy Kay, Ivan Tuttle, Jim Woodford, Dale Black, and a few others, where they almost all have the same encounter during their heaven experience, where they might describe it as, well, there's this nursery in heaven where all of the lost babies, aborted babies, children who die too young go. And it's a range of kind of the same aspects in every single one of these people's stories. And what's interesting is a lot of these guys, Randy included and others I've met, they don't feel released to share their story for 10, 15 years because they're afraid of being ridiculed or kind of losing their success in their secular job, if you will, because people have issue with this kind of stuff. And so it's not like they're out reading a bunch of other people's accounts and be like, all right, brother, we got to get together and make sure all of our stories are the same. Yet so many people have seen this vision of this place where children who are lost too soon go. Ivan Tuttle has a beautiful part of his story that he shares where he saw in his vision not only the place where the lost children go, but as their parents were entering heaven, they would get this opportunity to and be received by and encounter their lost child who is at the age or how they needed to see them or receive them, and they're allowed to kind of process what they lost. And so that comes up a lot, and more than I would have expected. You get several of these folks who've had these experiences in the room, and this inevitably comes up. And so there is it's not a typical part of kind of the framework or the stages per se of what's typical in an NDE. But even with the sample size of, Randy and I have interviewed probably 50 to 100 people, even to find 5 or 6 people who have this extremely consistent, similar, coherent story they tell of what they saw in heaven, I find it quite striking. Like if it was once or twice and it was quite variable, I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting and anecdotally, but to see it so many times has been quite fascinating. And even we did an event where we filmed for my TV show here in Greenville the other year, and I had Randy Kay and Ivan Tuttle stay for our Sunday service, and we just did kind of like a live interview Q&A from the stage on Sunday. And just when Ivan shared that part of his journey, his experience, the ministry that happened after the service, parents who had, lost a child to various crisis situations, they found me after the fact, were like that prayer time with Ivan really brought some healing and closure to us, and that sort of a thing. So, when people share that aspect of these experiences, that's probably one of the bigger ministry impacts. When people hear that, I think it gives them a real hope and a belief that I'm going to get to reconnect with my lost child in heaven someday. And so, of all the things we've shared, that probably has, top 3 impact in terms of ministry and lives being changed.
I can see that. You mentioned the 9 stages of this journey that you have categorized, and I probably should have followed up on it at the time, but I'm sort of taking a nonlinear approach to this interview. What are they, and why did you choose to organize the book that way?
You're gonna have to let me look at my book so I can talk through it. Well, it was interesting because I did an interview for a book called The Timeline New Testament, which is something that we publish at Destiny Image, and just in the interview, that particular author, he was like, when we put the New Testament in chronological order, it really differs how you view something and how you process something. Mm-hmm. And I was like, man, because I was actually a ways into the research for this project. And I was like, man, I hadn't really thought of organizing it this way. But so it completely changed the trajectory. Like I changed the structure of the book because of it. But I'll walk through the 9 stages just quickly, just to give people the context. So gateway to the afterlife is kind of like what gets you there. You're like, what was the circumstance where, buddy, you crossed the veil? Welcome to a whole new experience. After that, an out of body experience. Basically, your spirit is leaving your body. Typically, people will have some kind of a time that they're still kind of here spiritually here on the earth before they go towards a light or a tunnel and cross some kind of a threshold to the other side. Heightened senses. When people are out of their body, they talk about once they're no longer tethered to their physical body. And again, many of these people, they experience something traumatic or they were quite sick, all of a sudden they'll be like, I feel better than I've ever felt in my life. And so people do talk about that. It's like you have 6 senses or 11 senses, and they're all dialed up to 11 or 12. And it's just, there's an intensity to it. And then encountering other beings, those could be angels, some member of the Godhead, whether it's the Father or Jesus, sometimes the Holy Spirit, usually it tends to be Jesus or the Father, angels, demons. Some people talk about seeing Satan. Did you experience a welcoming committee? A lot of times people will see their, departed family members, friends, welcoming them into heaven right after they cross over. What else do we got? Life review. People will very typically have some sort of a life review where they are basically going over. Yeah, for those who can't see, that was my 4-year-old coming to visit me. Basically, in a life review, you are walking through some of the different things that you did in your life, and good things, bad things. And this is actually what I wanted to touch on earlier when I had kind of my brain freeze. Even wayward folks who don't know the Lord, they will see in their life review that Jesus was with them, and all the good things in their life, and especially in the midst of the bad things, whether it's something that they did that was not great or just bad circumstances, that Jesus was always by their side, even though they didn't remember it or didn't know about it. And even in the life review, this is something that has struck me from Randy Kay's story. And I've heard him tell his story, I think 50 plus times at this point, but he'll tell you, I had my life review, Jesus was showing me these things in my life that were good, the things in my life that were not great. But when he knows that they reviewed things that were quote unquote bad, but he couldn't tell you what those are anymore. Like he can remember that they talked about them, but kind of as far as the East is from the West, the blood of Jesus covers those things. And so He knows they reviewed them, but he can't actually tell you what they were, which I find really, really fascinating. What else do we got? Encountering otherworldly, heavenly, or hellish realms. People are going to encounter heaven, hell. It's kind of variable. Learning special knowledge. Sometimes people will be given, like in one of my favorite stories, Rita McPherson. Her family has this horrific car accident, and this is 30 some years ago. If I remember correctly, both their boys are thrown from the vehicle. Their son Aldo has traumatic brain injury, is in a coma, and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so she's in this time of extreme prayer and intercession. But while Aldo is on the other side, he meets another boy who's in heaven and says, hey, I want you to bring back a message to my parents. And ironically, while Aldo was in his coma, this family actually reaches out to Rita and just says, hey, we lost our son. We know what you're going through. But it wasn't anybody she knew. And so as Aldo gets better, and he still has a lot of health issues even 30 years later, but he says, hey, I met this boy. He asked me to get this message to his parents. And so of all things, she faxes them. I don't know if that was just the easiest way to communicate back then or what, but she gets a hold of them, and they come back to her like, we've been praying and just seeking the Lord on, is our son okay? Is he in heaven? And there were a few other very specific things. I think he even said to tell them to sell their airplane, and they were in business, and I think very well to do. And they sell all their stuff, and they become missionaries and start serving the Lord and take this complete left turn in life. So that would be an extreme example of learning special knowledge. But sometimes people will see visions of the future or some kind of special, and that really is one of the things why people I think are attracted to these stories. Like, what's the special knowledge that you brought back from heaven or experience on the other side? Almost done. Returning to your earthbound body, I like to think of it as, hey, tell me about your re-entry. And it's quite fascinating. Some of them are, it's like, I woke up and I was in my bedroom back in my body. Other people like, it was like the reverse of leaving the body. It's all of a sudden I was being pulled back. Heidi Barr even talks about how it was like jarring and like, almost like her spirit didn't fit back inside her body. Like it was painful to be put back into her body. So some people it's very simple. Other it seems to be kind of crazy. And then last, kind of post NDE lingering effects, in the sense that nobody is the same. A lot of people, if they have a distressing or disturbing NDE, the more the hell experience, a lot of them will have kind of PTSD that they have to deal with and process just because of the horrifying things they saw and experienced. People who tend to lean more into the heaven experience, their personalities will tend to shift dramatically. A lot of experiencers, they can't keep the same job they have. Some of them even get divorced because their personalities shift so significantly. Randy, for instance, so Randy was a CEO, a coach, and a trainer, and all kinds of crazy stuff. And he used to do these personality assessments just as part of the training they did. And before his near-death experience, he did not rank in the quadrant of being empathetic or caring or loving. Not going to say Randy was a jerk, but he would be like, didn't really care all that much. And he continued to do training and such, once he recovered from his near-death experience. And he did this same battery of tests after his experience, and he ranked in a completely different quadrant where he was extremely empathetic. And I'll tell you, Randy is one of the kindest men I've ever met. And so before his encounter, I'm not saying it's scientific proof, but it shows you how much his personality actually shifted. And even in terms of those lingering effects, so many people just have this burden to reach the lost, preach the gospel in a way that, didn't even, some of them, it was non-existent. They didn't even know the Lord and before their experience. So, but yeah, those are the 9 stages. It's actually how we organize the book. Basically, we take, I think it was 17 or 19 stories. You got to get that number straight. But basically, the whole book is structured around these 9 steps. And I put the aspects of each of these stories in the order of this framework. And so you'll get to immerse yourself into what it looked like for 10, 15 people. What was it that took them to the other side? And then when we get to the end of that section, there's some commentary, some questions to think through just to help you process what did that look like. And so the whole focus is we want to try to immerse, because that's the challenge with these stories. I think if you follow one person's story, you fixate on a few highlights from the story that really strike you. You're like, that's kind of interesting. But to walk you through each of these stages and immerse yourself in a range of stories to go, oh, wow, there's some consistencies here. There's actually some diversity and some differences in what people experienced. And so I've never seen anybody lay out a book quite like this in the near-death experience space. But my goal is just to get you immersed so you can really start to get a handle on, oh man, this must be what these different stages look like, what they kind of feel like. I think for people who've had experiences where it could be helpful, because again, it takes 7 years for somebody to process you have one of these experiences. On average, it's going to take you 7 years to come to terms with it. I don't know if it's just that our brain can't process it, but one of the things that's really helpful for people who are trying to process these experiences is giving them some kind of structure to be able to write out, think through their story, even give them some tools to help them communicate it effectively and that sort of a thing. So again, like I said earlier, this structure, extremely normal on the mainstream side. On the Christian side, this is very new. And Randy and I hope it empowers people to, share their own story, or, there's a real opportunity, I think, with near-death experiences to talk with non-believers. You look at the popular of ghost hunting shows and all the paranormal shows. There is an extreme interest in the paranormal and spiritual topics. Near-death experiences are no exception. People are fascinated by these. I find, just as I meet people out and about, like, what do you do? Tell me you have a book on near-death experiences. It opens some great conversations where you can just share some of these stories. And so I think there's a real ministry opportunity with these, that if it was a lot of other things I might put in a Christian book, there just isn't interest. But for whatever reason, near-death experiences is sort of a universal fascination, and just a safe topic where even the person who is, could be further from the Lord, they want to know what happens when they die too. And
Sure.
so it's a real opportunity for great conversations.
Yeah. Near-death experiences, 101 short stories that will help you understand heaven, hell, and the afterlife. Randy Kay and Shaun Tabatt, co-authors. Shaun, sounds like you've got your hands full, as I know that you and Lynette have been struggling with her brain cancer for the last 18 months. But rather than extend this conversation any longer, sounds like your children need daddy around. I will let you go now. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule and away from your family to talk with us about the book.
Oh, totally my pleasure, Derek. Anytime I get to see you or Sharon is a true joy. And again, Randy's in my prayer for this book. I hope it's a real blessing to your audience, because as we've seen over the past 5 years, just sharing these stories makes a real impact in people's lives.
Amen.
Check the show notes at VFTB.net or wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast to get the link to where you can get the latest book by Shaun Tabatt and Randy Kay. It's, again, one of the three big questions of life. What happens to us when we die? Perhaps some insight in this new book. Coming up, yes, if you had 3 to 4 weeks on the bingo card for how long it would take liberal media to start comparing Christians in America to Hamas, you are right. Bless their pointy little heads, and an update on Skywatch TV's virtual conference straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues.
Everybody, believe it or not, this is October, and that means you get a brand new GHTV special offer.
We're approaching Halloween, the time of year when the world around us is focused on ghosts and goblins and devils and demons.
But they're real.
They're real, and we'd like to give you good information about those entities with our October special. First, our book Veneration, where we analyze the ancient cult of the Nephilim, the origin of demons exposed in this book. Vicki Joy Anderson's important book, They Only Come Out at Night, about night terrors and sleep paralysis.
You need this book at home for your kids and grandkids. Trust me, it is a great book.
And 7 hours of audio interviews with the late Dr. Michael Heiser about the nature of the unseen realm.
Oh, this is a collector's disc.
It really is. Altogether, these three items purchased separately worth $65 during the month of October, just $35 plus shipping and handling. Take advantage of this because this is good, solid, scholarly information, especially the content from Dr. Heiser.
It is, and particularly this month, you want to be armed with the truth when your family asks, what about witches? What about wizards? What about these things at Halloween? What do we do with this? It's a time to teach.
Absolutely. Take advantage of our October special offer. Veneration, They Only Come Out at Night, and The Unseen Adversary, yours for just $35 plus shipping and handling only at gilberthouse.org/store.
Walking the walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. Also, gilberthouse.org, my personal website, derekpgilbert.com. All of the social media sites. This site? I think so. Anyway, you'll find us all here. And, of course, if you are subscribing on YouTube, thank you. God bless you. But please take a moment and download our free mobile app, which guarantees we won't get canceled because this is our app. Christian company that has developed the app hosts the content, and they are not inclined to censor us. So this bypasses the gatekeepers of big tech. Also adds some additional features like there is an audio Bible with multiple translations and the messaging section where you can interact, kind of a social media, but it's kind of an enclosed social media site where you can share notes, messages, prayer requests, and pray for others as well. You'll find the link for the app at VFTB.net. Check the top menu bar or go to gilberthouse.org/app. Gilbert House being, of course, the web hub for everything we do here at the ministry. You can see behind me, depending on how close I crop in this video, the barn is still a work in process. That is, the editing setup that I've got here is really great. I've got 2 desks side by side with 3 Mac Minis, so that is really cool. Need to come up with something a little bit more visually attractive, I think, than what we've got at the moment. But this will serve for now. So as you can see, we still got some other shoulder stuff behind me here to get the wall paneling up. Got the paneling here on this wall. Got the paneling on the wall I'm facing. We've got a couple more walls to finish off as our contractor has time. The Unraveling Revelation set just behind the screen behind me will soon, that area will soon be staged and set. We'll start recording some Unraveling Revelation programs in there. The area up above, the rafters and the exposed spray foam insulation on the ceiling, we're just going to leave that as is. No point in enclosing all of that. And actually, it helps kind of cut down on some of the echoes in here, which is great since we don't have the budget or really want to spend the money to do professional sound treating. I've seen what you have to do for that in recording studios, in commercial broadcast facilities, and we're just, we're not going to go there. If we've got to use echo remover in the post-production, we'll do that, but we're not going to spend what it really costs. But again, the spray foam insulation does help. The shape and all the open cell stuff does help knock down echoes. So thank you again for your participation, your generosity in helping to make Build Barn Better a reality. Because the truth is, a lot of the spaces we've been using for the past year and a half as we've worked from home have been in our bedrooms, frankly. And one of the spaces is like right a sitting room off the master. So when Sharon's in bed, if I've got something I need to record, it's not like I can just go in there and say, honey, I'm going to use the studio for a few minutes. Hope you don't mind if I, bother you. So now I'm on the other side of the yard and I can make all the noise I want to out here. And again, thank you very much for making that possible. Well, it was not really a surprise to see that progressive media, which is almost an oxymoron. I mean, it's redundant. What is it? They call it no, there's another word for it. Anyway, you're basically saying the same thing twice. But anyway, corporate media, a journalist waited just long enough for it to be, acceptable to start comparing conservative Christians and the nationalist movement here in the United States with Hamas, actually saying it's worse than Hamas. That may sound like an exaggeration, but literally in the November 2nd edition of Salon, which is a left-wing online news site, journalist Brian Karem, who's a longtime White House journalist, wrote a commentary, an op-ed piece under the title, the headline, MAGA and Christian Nationalism, Bigger Threat to America Than Hamas Could Ever Be. Christian nationalism and Make America Great Again, a bigger threat to America than Hamas could ever be. I mean, this may be a surprise to you. Sadly, it's not really much of a surprise to most of us who've been around for a little while. I guess if there was any surprise that it took almost 3 weeks, more than 3 weeks from the October 7th Hamas terror attack to actually see this kind of a headline. Yeah, we saw college kids on campuses across the country protesting anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests. They're young. They're brainwashed. That's not really a surprise. Doesn't excuse it, but it is not a surprise. But for the corporate media, Salon is on the fringes of corporate media, to actually put this out there in a headline. A little bit of a surprise, but again, it's about as much of a surprise that it took 3+ weeks. The article actually makes the claim that the election of Mike Johnson, representative from Louisiana, conservative Christian Republican, to Speaker of the House, shows that the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is ascendant, which is a greater threat to America than violent Islam. And note, I don't say radical Islam. If you followed this program for any length of time, I encourage you to, well, you already know why I'm saying that. If you have not, I encourage you to go into the archives and look up the interviews with Raymond Ibrahim and Timothy Furnish. There is a difference. Violent Islam is not radical Islam, because violent Islam is actually, that's the way it was taught by the Prophet. So for somebody like Brian Karem to make this statement that conservative Christian nationalists are a greater threat to America than Hamas shows a fundamental or perhaps willful misunderstanding of what Hamas stands for, of what Christians believe and stand for, or both. And we could go off on him and rail against it, but this is par for the course. Again, remember, only 7% of Americans have a biblical worldview. So if you're watching or listening to this program, the odds are that you're in the minority. And to Brian Karem and those who read his column and say, yes, you're right, Trump supporters are a greater threat to America, bless your pointy little head. Skywatch TV's virtual conference was originally set for November. This will sadly be the last virtual conference in which Tom Horn will participate. He had recorded his his presentation already. It was in the production process when he suffered his heart attack on October 11th, went into the hospital, and as you know by now, was called home to be with the Lord. And a decision was made, and I think a wise one, to postpone the virtual conference until spring. So this likely will be launched in February rather than this month. So we will give you details on that when that's been firmed up, but it will definitely be after the first of the year. Our Israel tour is the next event on our calendar for Sharon and me. That scheduled March 31st through April 9th, obviously, as we are now in the first week of November, and the war between Israel and Hamas, and with Hezbollah taking potshots from across the northern border, actually both northern borders, Lebanon and Syria. We are watching the situation closely, and we will make a decision in December about the tour. But if you've already put down a deposit, and we know that there are some people who've paid for their tours in full, we will not make the announcement here on a program and expect you to catch it during one of the podcast episodes or something like that. We will make a special announcement, and of course, Lipkin Tours will send notification to you via email. So if you've already registered for the tour and you're wondering what the status is, at this point, we're still planning to go, but we're not going to take a tour group into a war zone. We have no desire to fly into a war zone ourselves. We were there in 2018 during the days of rage when President Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, and Hamas had a bunch of riots going on along the border. We saw nothing in Israel. We were in Israel back in the spring when there were some well-meaning journalists who were saying that because the protests over judicial reform were making a lot of headlines here in the West, that they somehow had gotten the idea and the word had gotten out that a lot more was happening than actually was. Let me just put it that way. We didn't see we saw a few people here at an intersection, like standing in the middle of the roundabout, waving Israeli flags and holding signs. That was about it. But this is a whole nother level of activity. And so we will reassess here in about another month and see what's going on at that point. If it looks like things are going to calm down, we will proceed as planned. But if it looks like things are going to continue for a while, and that is possible, we will postpone. And of course, we went through this with the pandemic, where we had to postpone the tour 4 times. So again, if you've already signed up, we'll make sure that you are notified. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen wherever you are consuming this podcast, whether it's YouTube, our Gilbert House app, or audio only via one of the many podcatchers out there like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. We appreciate it if you give us a thumbs up at our Facebook page, the View from the Bunker page there. Our announcer, tip of the headphones to the inimitable D.C. Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We do this because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.